Without further ado, I want to turn us over to Jason Freund, our first speaker of today, to get us started. And Jason is going to be presenting on some recent work looking at brook and brown trout distributions.
I titled this Across the Driftless. Well, I'm really kind of in the same spot that Brandon was yesterday. So that is Monroe County, Vernon County, a little bit into La Crosse County. So we're kind of covering that sandstone geology of Monroe and La Crosse counties and the more dolostone geology of Vernon County in particular. So first of all, thanks to Kirk in particular and the fisheries crew. That's where I got the data from. So I asked for some fisheries data to kind of go along with the habitat and watershed data that we had collected. Brandon helped collect a lot of this data. Dr. Schumann gave some insights onto kind of the presentation and data analysis stuff. And then, of course, River Study Center here at UWL. So I kind of started this at brown trout have replaced brook trout in much of the driftless area, and it's been a pretty big issue. And probably we don't really understand exactly why this has happened, and particularly in a few streams I'll talk about, and then why it is that brook trout really thrive in some parts of the driftless area, and particularly in that sandstone geology when we'd electrofish it. So we went out with Kirk and did that a couple of times, and we would get nothing but brook trout. So I always like kind of start with a little bit of kind of ecology basis. And one of the things is this idea of this filter analogy. This is just one of these ideas, but we think at big, broad regional scales, cold water streams are fairly limited in species. Brown trout are only here because, well, we brought them here, right? So they shouldn't be part of our regional species pool, but they are because they've been brought here, 150-ish years ago. We have these abiotic filters, and for fishes, temperatures are really strong ones. So we expect really different fishes in cold water streams compared to as those streams get warmer. As a matter of fact, the best cold water streams we think of as having brook trout and maybe sculpin and really not much else. And then local process. So at the local level, we talk about these reach scale and watershed comparisons. Biotic interactions is a really strong one, as I'll talk about. So competition and predation in particular plays a really big, strong role, we think. And then kind of unique to this story, at least, these really small localized barriers, in our case, dams, that have sort of served to keep brown trout out has played a big role. And we'll talk about those a little bit. And then, this is kind of the list to wow you and to show you like here, factors that are affecting species distribution. Well, there's a ton of them, and they're everything from evolutionary history and temperature, water quality, quantity, all this stuff, flow regime, harvest. I mean, it's really hard to kind of get a good understanding of why species are where they are because there is so much going on. And of course, a lot of it's temperature, right? So this was from my old lab in West Virginia. So we did some of the early work before they did the restoration work. And we look at things like the temperature productivity squeeze, that brook trout growth, that they use the main stem of the river. However, with brown trout being in the main stem of the river, they don't have access fully to these higher growth habitats. So that is where they can eat minnows and darters and other fishes, where they can grow bigger than just eating insects. And we see lots of other studies looking at climate change effects, looking at specific responses of fishes and land cover and all kinds of different things that we look at. But we know that temperature plays a huge role in why brook trout are some places and not others, and conversely why brown trout are doing well in some streams and potentially maybe not in others. And so this is from Metro. This is a really good look at thinking about brook trout in a changing climate. So here we are near future and then farther future by the end of the century. And we note again, so what Brandon had talked a little bit about last time and put a box around this area, some of our sites are going to be in this green area that my cursor is by. So in northern part of Monroe County, where kind of one of the places in the driftless, one of the few places in the driftless where brook trout look to be holding on. And of course, when we look at brown trout futures, well, they look a whole lot brighter, right? So we see that we expect the persistence of brown trout to occur in many, many more places in the state than than do brook trout. And this, all really has to do with stream temperatures. So it is, of course, largely temperature. And this was a really good paper looking at, so the effects of, so looking at historic data and finding, I think most notably, that if we look at summer maximum temperature, that led to an increase, a positive effect on brown trout and a negative effect on brook trout. So those two things opposed one another. And that was kind of the strongest thing they saw. They also saw that we had a greater effect as we went farther south as well. So here in the Driftless in particular. And so we're really kind of seeing what these climate change models kind of predicted would happen. We are starting to see that here. So one of the ways that we can look at this, and I have a undergraduate student who is looking at this, maybe she'll present next year, but looking at this bioenergetics model, and it just kind of says what goes in must come out or turn into growth. And these are really strongly temperature dependent. So we've played around with these bioenergetics models a little bit, looking at sort of this temperature ranges. So here we look at brook trout, this kind of, I don't know, turquoise colored line, find a fairly normal trout response here, where at about 15 degrees is sort of their maximum, and it falls off as it gets warmer, and a little slower metabolism as it's colder. And then we look at brown trout, the other species that we have here. And how do you put this? Their curve looks a whole lot more like a brown bullhead than it does a trout species. So kind of a cold water bullhead. They are really efficient. It's kind of one of the big issues we saw. So we start playing around with some of our summer data and feeding it into the Wisconsin bioenergetics model, and see that what's maybe most striking here, looking at one particular stream, and you'll notice we start with a 200-gram brook trout, which is a very big brook trout, and it only gets to maybe 225 grams by the end of the summer, whereas that same with a brown trout, we're getting to 350-ish grams. So this idea that brown trout are just very bioenergetically efficient, and that's sort of one of the big competitive advantages that they seem to have. So we have, kind of two big questions. Why are brown trout absent, or at least less common, in the sandstone and sand streams of the Driftless? That was kind of striking this summer, that we, here where I usually fish and where I usually am, we expect brown trout just about everywhere, and brook trout are rare. What's totally the converse there? And we see that, kind of this brown trout have taken over some of these small headwater streams. So in particular, a couple of the streams I'm going to talk about today are Seas Branch above the dam, and then Mapledale and Pine Hollow, which is the tributary to it, and how they're only brook trout streams now because we've removed the brown trout from them. And I thought this was kind of interesting looking back at the record. So this is Big Creek, and we had a number of streams in the Big Creek watershed. It's a really neat place in the sandstone streams, kind of up by Cataract, that area. And what we saw here is, I thought really interesting, is in the kind of mid-90s, we stocked brown trout in there, but they didn't take. We went and electrofished 2 different sites there, and we got nothing but brook trout in terms of the trout we caught. So, so it's not just temperature, right? It's barriers that played a big role. So Seas Branch and Mapledale, as we talked about, although there again, kind of curious that brown trout did take over. So maybe there is a temperature thing there, and maybe those streams are thermally, even a bit on the edge for brook trout. I don't know. Although, as we'll see in the data, brook trout are doing quite well there. Habitat differences. So rock versus sand. Thinking about, in particular, macroinvertebrates, that we just see a much, much higher density of macroinvertebrates in the dolostone compared to the sandstone. And then one of the things, I know Casey talked about this a fair bit the other day about overhead cover, and you kind of hear this, that overhead cover leads to more brown trout, and maybe that's something, and brook trout don't necessarily like the overhead cover. And then productivity. So I think one of the big things, and we'll talk about this in terms of, we use conductivity as a measure of productivity, and there's a huge difference in productivity among those streams. The dolostone streams, just much, much more productive. So to talk about these a little bit, here's one of these sites where, again, this dam is essentially what's allowing the brook trout to persist above the barrier. So we have them in, we tend to think about brook trout in headwater streams in this area. Whereas when we go to the sandstone, that's not really true. We find them in streams that are quite large and nothing but brook trout. We often find them above barriers in the dolostone, not so much in the sandstone. And it kind of leads us to ask, why was it Browns were so successful in a creek like Mapledale and Pine Hollow when, they are quintessentially what we would think of as brook trout streams in this area. So one of the things we did is we looked at overhead cover. Does it favor brown trout? Well, we found no difference in sandstone and dolostone for a percent of overhead cover. So we included what we called overhead cover, undercut banks, which for some reason we use for one site instead of calling it overhead cover, root wads, large woody debris, and man-made structures. Didn't include aquatic vegetation, although I'd probably argue that too is largely overhead cover. And if we look at our cover types for our stream, so this is when we did our surveys, we see that so the kind of the brownish colors are the more overhead covers, the green is aquatic vegetation. Those are kind of the two dominant things that we see in here. In some places, particularly in a few creeks, we get big rocks. So that is boulders and things like that providing much of the cover. So what we kind of saw in these sandstone streams is overhead cover is plentiful and brook trout use it. And as a matter of fact, I think that was kind of one of the most striking things from our snorkel surveys is we'd go along some of these creeks and there would be this amazing undercut bank and no trout under it. So the density of fishes is so different in those streams, as you'll see here in a figure. So maybe it's lack of spawning substrate. So that is that we know that brook trout can spawn in essentially what we'd call coarse sands, really fine gravels, and maybe that allows them to persist. We also know that they can spawn in really small streams. So in little tiny spring runs, we will find brook trout spawning, and we think that's probably part of what's maybe feeding into this. Here's that productivity figure. So talking about conductivity, and we found that in our dolostone streams to the left here, high conductivities, average somewhere around 400 microsiemens per centimeter, whereas much lower, greater variability, but much lower in the sandstone streams. So maybe it's just that the brook trout probably do better without brown trout, and we'll see a lot of evidence of that here coming up. Do brown trout need higher productivity streams? That's kind of one of the things I wonder a bit about, and we don't have good data to support that yet, but it does seem that maybe productivity plays a role and that brown trout do better in those higher productivity streams. So here is looking at the brook trout catch per mile from the fisheries data from Kirk. And what we see that really stands out are these three streams above barriers in the dolostone have by far the highest catch rates, and it's not even particularly close, right? So that role of productivity is pretty strong here. Whereas we have a few of these other creeks that are also in the dolostone dominated by brown trout that we just see really low brook trout. And then again, there were a number of streams that did make this list because their brook trout catch rates were 0. So correlation matrix, I always think, is a really good way to just start to understand what it is your data look like. We're taking sort of a landscape level look here. And what we see, one of the most striking things is, so this proportion of the trout that were brook trout, and it's really strongly negatively correlated with the brown trout catch rates. And we see this, I thought was kind of interesting, is basin area was basically not correlated with anything, which told us that we kind of can talk about this across all sizes of streams. We see that our connectivity, so here YSI conductive or cond is on here, but it's a really good measure of basically tells us a lot about the geology types. So we expect in the dolostone, we have greater pasture and more open land use. We have lower forest and less high infiltration, more moderate and slow infiltration. And those correlate really strongly with their connectivity. So it's a really good measure that kind of incorporates this site type, whether it's dolostone or sandstone. And then sites with a high proportion of brook trout are associated with forest cover and high infiltration rate. So that is where we get a high number of brook trout. They tend to be forested watersheds, which what we would have expected from the literature. 65% seems 65% forest cover in the watershed seems to be kind of a magic number in many studies. And we see that brook trout are negatively associated with the connectivity, open land uses, and elevation, which is really just sort of another measure of site type, because the higher elevations are in the dolostone and the lower elevations are in the sandstone. So we look at, kind of ignoring temperature, this gives us 20 sites to look at. So all of those with the D are the dolostone, and those with the S are the sandstone. We'll notice our first axis in our PCA explains a lot of our variability. We basically have things that are associated with the dolostone, so that is pasture, the conductivity and elevation on one side, and then percent forest and high infiltration associated with the sandstone on the other side on the first axis. And then the second axis is really kind of driven by the brown trout catch rates. So high catch rates to low catch rates. So we ran some models looking at some AIC models for multiple linear regression and found that brook trout as a proportion of the trout was predicted by brown trout catch rates, so negatively associated with those. So when brown trout were high, brook trout as a proportion of trout were low. They were positively correlated with forest, and then a host of other variables, and we got a pretty strong model there. We look at brook trout catch rates, we found that negatively associated with percent cultivated, so that is agriculture in the watershed, and positively associated with the forest cover, and negatively with slow infiltration, or positively with high infiltration rates. And then for brown trout here, their catch rates were only defined by the percent pasture in the watershed, and not terribly strongly. So now we're going to ignore temperature, and we're doing this largely because we have, we only have temperatures from 10 sites, and that doesn't include our 3 highest brook trout CPE sites. So that is our highest catch rates for brook trout. So Maple Dales and Seas and Pine Hollow aren't included in this. But when we look now largely at the sandstone streams, then what we see is that the proportion of trout as brook trout was predicted really well by brown trout catch rates. So that is where there were brown trout, we didn't get brook trout. They were negatively with pasture as well, and then positively with high infiltration rate. And you'll notice this model fit really well. I mean, shockingly well for an ecological model. We couldn't predict, however, brown trout or brook trout catch rates, we were unable to predict. So we're able to predict their presence, or kind of what proportion they were, but not so much their catch rates. And then when we look at brown trout, their catch rates were predicted by conductivity and open land use, negatively with forest, and a host of other things. And I think maybe most interestingly is, kind of as Brandon alluded to or talked about a little bit the other day, that these dolostone streams have a much greater range in temperature variability per day. So we looked at this coefficient of variation of summer temperature, and that was pretty important. So we have lots of caveats, of course. We're limited by our data, our N of 20 and 10 when we have temperature, and this is only midsummer temperature. There could be something going on outside of summer that's really important that we are not capturing with our temperature data. We have lots of factors that predict temperature that load in the models, sometimes temperature, but not always. Obviously, it is mostly temperature, but it could be these other things, the productivity, lack of spawning, and these habitat variables may show up. So we did a reach scale analysis as well, and I'll kind of go through this a little quickly, but we found that the proportion of brook trout was essentially, again, brown trout catch rates were the strongest effect on that, not surprisingly at all. So that kind of, I think the big take-home story is where you have lots of brown trout, you don't get brook trout. And I'll skip. So at the reach scale, looking at these models, proportion of brook trout was predicted by the brown trout, and then the distance cover. So that is that they liked cover being closer. And also I thought kind of interesting is it was positively associated with overhead cover. So as we got more brook trout when we had more overhead cover. So, and their catch rates were predicted by brown trout again, and overhead cover and plunge pools as cover. So again, brook trout tend to, I think that cover is important. It's just that the brown trout overwhelm everything else. And then brown trout, we just found it, the variation in current velocities. And to kind of look at this figure is kind of three important things here. So we look at the brook trout catch rates, they were associated with overhead cover. So that's what ADHS is kind of captures all of the overhead covers. We see that brown trout catch rates were associated with slow infiltration rates. And then I think really kind of importantly, that this brook trout catch rates was totally opposed to the brown trout catch rates. So where brown trout catch rates were high, brook trout catch rates were low. So brown trout seem to be a huge filter on brook trout, back to our filter analogy. So competition probably plays a huge role in this. Water temperature is likely a pretty big filter on brook trout, maybe on brown trout as well. Have a little bit less evidence there. Is productivity a filter that excludes brown trout? I don't know that we know that very well. And I'd kind of say above all else, don't put brown trout where there are currently brook trout, right? If we're thinking about management recommendations, brown trout are a huge issue. So barriers will be a big, interesting one. So the two dams on Mapledale and Seas Branch, they're going to get V-notch this year. There's no plan for a barrier. Hopefully that changes. Otherwise, we're going to have kind of a natural experiment seeing how brown trout recolonize. Around habitat improvements are a little fuzzier, so I would avoid where we have sympatric trout populations, that is both brook and brown, because the brown trout tend to do a lot better in the habitat improvements, at least in the ones I'm familiar with. I'll be interested in talking to others about things that they found that work. Avoid without barriers to brown trout, a little less strong. And then where we have brook trout, so our high density site in particular, the highest density site, Seas Branch, was one that was improved, and we had a great density of brook trout, but largely because there were no brown trout. And then I think role of harvest. So I know Casey mentioned this the other day, and I think it's a really strong regulation, this, keeping more brown trout, but not allowing brook trout to get harvested in some places. And then this just kind of shows, this was from my old lab as well. And what I thought was really cool here is talking about, so this delta current velocity is that basically what we saw is that when there were only brook trout present in a pool, they used they were next to fast currents. When brown trout were present, they no longer occupied those best places. And I think that's one of the big things we see with that relationship between brook and brown trout. And of course, we need more and better data for this. This is kind of correlation data, and we need more data to be able to really talk about this. And so why do brown trout take over restoration sites? I don't exactly know. I don't think it's just necessarily overhead cover. I think it's lots of other things, but I think it's that brown trout are largely able to prevent brook trout from using overhead cover when they're in sympatry. That is both species together. Our snorkel surveys, so we did these in allopatric brook trout streams, so brook trout only streams. They used overhead cover. It's, I think, really different when brown trout are present. These lower productivity sites had an abundance of unused cover. And there may be other factors like macroinvertebrate production, spawning gravel, and all this that may limit brown trout in some places. And also by speeding up the stream, getting down to gravel again in some of these sandy reaches, that may be why brown trout are able to increase. So I don't think and I think kind of the big lesson is it's really hard to restore brook trout when there are brown trout present. So that was the really strongest negative, were those brown trout in all of our analyses. So